Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids
and their grown-ups, where we explore interesting people, places, and ponderings that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Welcome to episode 6 of Check This Out. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you can be the first to get new episodes. In today's episode, we are going to learn about a famous American named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Do you know who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is? If you already know who Dr. King is, great! I'm excited you're coming in with a little bit of knowledge. And if the answer is no, you may have heard of him because of his famous I Have a Dream speech, or because there's a holiday in the United States about him, or because lots of streets and schools and parks are named after him. But if you aren't quite sure who he is and why we talk about him as a famous American, that's all right, because we're going to tell you all about him today. Before we introduce you to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or help you to get to know him even better, I do want to call something out. We may talk about some things in this episode that are hard to understand because Dr. King's life's work was about civil rights and race relations. He fought against things like segregation, the Jim Crow laws, and the mistreatment of Black people at the hand of figures of authority. The United States and the world still has a lot to do when it comes to the treatment of people of color and historically marginalized groups like Black and Indigenous people in the United States. We hope that learning about Dr. King and his fight for Black rights, equality, and civil rights inspires you to be curious and learn more. Your questions are important. Talk to a trusted grown-up, teachers, your local librarian, or a friend about what questions you might have after learning about Martin Luther King Jr. and the events that happened during the course of his life. With that, let's dive in to learn more about this famous American. Martin Luther King Jr. was born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His parents were college educated and his father was a pastor. He had 2 siblings and grew up in a middle-class Black community called Sweet Auburn in Atlanta.
Check this out.
Here's a fun fact. Do you know that his birth name was actually Michael, but was later changed to Martin? It was changed by his father to honor Martin Luther, the German Protestant leader.
I learned something new today.
Martin Luther King Jr. attended segregated public schools while growing up. Do you know what the term segregated means?
I don't know.
Back before the Civil Rights Act, places like school were segregated into white and colored. This means that white kids went to school with other white kids and Black kids went to school with other Black kids. In 1954, there was a big Supreme Court case called Brown versus the Board of Education, which declared that states could no longer maintain or establish laws allowing separate schools for Black and white students. But this happened after Dr. King went to school.
That must have been hard.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a talented student and involved too. He was a member of a team in his high school that actually helped lead to some of his successes as a civil rights leader later on. Take a guess. Do you think he was on A, the chess team, B, the debate team, or C, the polo team?
I think I know the answer.
If you said B, you're right. He is remembered as a great orator or speaker, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s time on the debate team certainly would have helped him build those skills as a young man. Martin Luther King Jr. graduated from high school at the age of 15.
Whoa!
He then attended Morehouse College, a historically Black college. From Morehouse, he received a degree in sociology in 1948. Morehouse College is the college that both Martin Luther King Jr.'s father and grandmother attended.
That is cool.
Before he went to college, he had the experience of working on a tobacco farm in Connecticut over the summer, and he saw how race relations were different in the North and what desegregation could be. It reinforced his dislike of the segregated South. After graduation from Morehouse College, Dr. King studied theology, or religious studies. He graduated in 1951. Dr. King was elected student body president of a mostly white class, which at the time was fairly unheard of. He was so successful in his studies that he won a fellowship, which he used to apply to Boston University for graduate school. This is where he got his doctorate degree in theology in 1955. In Boston, he met his wife, Coretta Scott. Eventually, he had 4 children with her. Martin Luther King Jr.'s first big civil rights movement was leading the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955.
Check this out.
The Montgomery bus boycott was a massive protest that came out of Rosa Parks being arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white man on a bus. The boycott was led against the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama, by civil rights activists, specifically with Martin Luther King Jr. as the spokesperson. It was a 381-day boycott. That's more than a year. That boycott led to a U.S. Supreme Court decision that segregation laws on buses were unconstitutional. This boycott received national press, and it introduced Martin Luther King Jr. as a national civil rights leader to the country. A boycott is when people refuse to use a service or spend money on a certain thing. Thousands of people stopped taking the bus over those 381 days, and the city of Montgomery lost a lot of money. Martin Luther King Jr. was able to use the success of the Montgomery boycott to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, otherwise known as the SCLC. It provided a civil rights platform for him to speak all over the country about race-related issues and meet with civil rights leaders in the United States and other countries. Dr. King even traveled to India and was influenced by Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest. In 1960, Dr. King and his family moved back to Atlanta, where he was born, and he served as a co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Do you know who his other co-pastor was? It was his dad. Although Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor, he spent much of his time with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and in October of 1960, he participated in sit-in demonstrations with Black college students. As a result, he was arrested. Martin Luther King was arrested a lot during his 13 years as a civil rights leader. Do you want to take a guess at how many?
I don't know.
Was it A, 30 times, B, 23 times, or C, 13 times?
Mama, can I guess? A.
Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested 30 times over the course of his time as a civil rights leader. Dr. King was standing up to a long-held status quo in the United States, and many people in power were resistant to Black people having more rights and equal opportunities. Unfortunately, there were a lot of laws that made this inequality allowed. So when Dr. King protested or demonstrated, he might be breaking the laws of that era. Not only did he have to endure 30 arrests as a result of his civil rights work, Dr. King's life was often put at risk as a result of his involvement in the movement. His home was bombed, and he regularly received threats against his life from people who were against the civil rights movement. But he continued his civil rights efforts in spite of the arrests and the threats.
He sounds really brave.
From 1960 to 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. was seemingly everywhere. He was on TV regularly, speaking to audiences about civil rights and race relations. And Dr. King was an eloquent speaker and a gifted writer, which helped him get the message out about civil rights to the broader American population. He even got to meet 2 presidents in his time as a civil rights leader.
Any guesses who they were?
Was it A, Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, B, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, or C, Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon?
If you think the answer is B, you're correct.
He got to meet John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson in his time as a civil rights leader. As I mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested several times, and in 1963, he wrote a famous letter from Birmingham jail after being arrested again for peacefully demonstrating against racial injustice. Hundreds were jailed in Birmingham after the police used violent tactics against peaceful demonstrators. He rallied supporters using the famous letter from a Birmingham jail. After his release, Dr. King helped organize and participated in a historic March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, he shared a speech with more than 200,000 demonstrators, both black and white, who had gathered peacefully on the National Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all under the law.
I want to check out more about that.
Do you know what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech on the National Mall was called? Was it A, the Set Us Free speech, B, I Believe in Equality speech, or C, the I Have a Dream speech?
If you pick C, that was a super duper good choice.
The 17-minute I Have a Dream speech is one of the most well-known speeches in history and inspired action after the march was over. Dr. King was one of many essential civil rights activists that fought for the liberation of the Black population and for equal protection under the law. These civil rights leaders fought to abolish the Jim Crow laws that created segregation in the South after the Civil War. Some of the people who Martin Luther King Jr. worked alongside included Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, Lyndon B. Johnson, his wife, Coretta Scott King, John Lewis, Ella Baker, Hosea Williams, and so many more.
They did so much.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 authorized the federal government to enforce desegregation, and it outlawed discrimination at businesses and employment based on race. This was the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize. At the time, he was the youngest ever male recipient. He was 35 when he won. And Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent struggle for civil rights for the Afro-American population. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a huge victory, there was still a lot of work to do on the path to equality for Black people. Dr. King helped organize a march from Selma, Alabama to the Capitol in Montgomery. John Lewis and Hosea Williams, other civil rights activists I mentioned earlier, led the Selma March. On March 7, 1965, the demonstrators and marchers were turned back when they were met by state troopers. The marchers were injured on TV by tear gas and state troopers with dogs and fire hoses and big sticks. 2 days after the initial march, Dr. King led another attempted Selma March, but stopped when they were again met with police forces. The original march was shown on the news, and it became known as Bloody Sunday. This caused national outrage, which, along with lots of other civil rights actions, led to the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Check this out.
What do you think happened in the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
Tell us.
At a high level, it outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many Southern states after the Civil War, including things like literacy tests as a prerequisite to allow Black people to vote. Although there was progress, there was still a lot of frustration and resentment at how long it was taking for things to change in the United States for Black people. And younger Black activists were frustrated with Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful approach, feeling it wasn't strong enough. After 1965, Dr. King expanded his focus from civil rights to also opposing the Vietnam War and supporting the poor. In April of 1968, Dr. King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike by the city's sanitation workers. While in Memphis, he was assassinated at his motel by a sniper. He was only 39 years old. Although he was a civil rights leader for only 13 years, Dr. King made a massive impact on the civil rights movement and our country. Martin Luther King Jr. is commemorated in the United States by a variety of ways to this day. Do you know what some of them are?
Here are just a few.
The King Memorial is on the Mall in Washington, D.C., near the Lincoln Memorial. There is a federal Martin Luther King Jr. Day. 2 books about Dr. King have won the Pulitzer Prize. In 1983, there was a 20th anniversary march on Washington, led by his wife, Coretta Scott King, and Stevie Wonder. There are schools, streets, and parks named for him.
He was a busy guy.
Phew, we talked about a lot.
Let's recap some of his achievements.
In 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. became the spokesman for the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks was arrested.
I want to check out more about that.
In 1957, Dr. King co-founded and was elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to provide new leadership for the civil rights movement. He would serve as the head of the SCLC until his assassination in 1968. In 1963, he led a coalition of a bunch of different civil rights groups in a nonviolent campaign aimed at Birmingham, Alabama. This led to his arrest and the writing of the famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail. In 1963, Dr. King was one of the driving forces behind the March on Washington, which drew over 250,000 people to the National Mall. This was where he shared his I Have a Dream speech. In 1964, Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent advocacy of Black rights. In 1964, with his help, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, and in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. It's truly incredible to hear how much he accomplished in his short life.
What was your favorite fact?
We are going to give you a few facts that you can continue to research after the podcast is over.
Here are 3 of our favorite facts.
Fact number 1, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, his Nobel Peace Prize lecture, and his Letter from a Birmingham Jail are among the most quoted speeches and writings in the English language. Check out these writings, watch his speeches, and learn about some of his famous quotes. Martin Luther King Jr. was the youngest person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize when he won in 1964 at age 35. Learn about why he won and what the Nobel Peace Prize is. Fact number 3. Martin Luther King Jr. played a critical role in the passing of both the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Learn more about both of these acts and the rights they provided and how they brought more equality to historically marginalized Americans, specifically Black people. By now, if you've been listening to our podcast, you know we don't just love investigating cool people, places, and ponderings from history.
We also love to rhyme.
Here's a poem we created about Martin Luther King Jr. In a world where opportunities were often small, Dr. King stood up and inspired us all. With a heart full of courage, he took a stand for equality and justice across the land. He spoke of love and the need for faith and peace, teaching us that hate and segregation must cease. From his Birmingham letter and dream speech came a hopeful call to unite as one, together we stand tall. We thank him for all he did, pushing for rights, and now it's our turn to keep fighting the fight. At Check This Out, we know it can be hard to know if information you find online is accurate. We use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. Our sources for this week's episode are nobelprize.org, the King Center, the NAACP, Encyclopedia Britannica, and History.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share.
Thanks for listening.